This video is part of a series on experiences of the Enneagram from the 27 subtypes. I'm aiming to interview people of each subtype, so you get to hear and experience what those different voices and life experiences sound like. I hope you enjoy. Hi, Chris. Thank you for taking the time to share with us today. Could you share with us the country that you live in, your Enneagram type, subtype, and instinctual sequence?
Sure. Chris Schoolcraft. I live in Texas in the United States, and I am a self-preservation 5. My sequence is self-preservation, sexual, social, repressed.
Thank you, Chris. So when it comes to the Enneagram, when did you first hear about it?
I've known about the Enneagram for a while, but I really didn't engage the Enneagram until I was serving in a church, and I had several staff people who were familiar with the Enneagram. They talked about the Enneagram. I kind of was a little reticent and apprehensive about it. I didn't like things that would put people in a box, or I didn't like how people were using the Enneagram at the time and talking about other people. So I was real hesitant about it. So I've known about it probably for, at least 10 years, but really hadn't started engaging it until about 7 years ago. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Chris. Yeah, you're speaking to the the way it can be used to stereotype people. And have you had a personal experience receiving being stereotyped in other typology systems, or what? How come that was a trigger for you?
Right. I think there's a natural desire within me to be unique and to be different and to be understood. And so anytime, whether it's Myers-Briggs or DISC or whatever, anytime there's a system in which people use that to act as if they understand you, without building a relationship with you and without getting to know you, that can be problematic for me.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. And has that always been true for you, or has that been more as a result of growth work that you've done?
I think it's always been true for me in some degree. I've grown up in places and lived in churches and places where not where people talked about other people, where people thought they knew other people, where people made strong assumptions about other people. And because individuality is really important to me, and in my type, individuality is really important, and being unique and having a sense of specialness to it. I think probably both of those things played together. So,
Okay. Thank you, Chris, because I'm almost hearing a little bit of the 4 in there as well.
well, yes,
Yeah.
in the part of the Enneagram world that talks about wings and being a 5-wing-6 or a 5-wing-4, I would lean more toward a 5-wing in terms of stronger part of who I am.
That's interesting. Thanks for that, Chris.
Yeah.
So, over the years, like especially this last 7 years that you've been kind of journeying with the Enneagram, what's been your experience with it?
Well, my experience was a difficult one in that I burned out at the church that I was serving before this current pastorate. And whenever, as I alluded to before, when someone was talking about the Enneagram, I was real hesitant. I really didn't want to learn much about it. Someone had said I should try it. I pushed back on it because I didn't want to participate in what I felt was this kind of pigeonholing of people without knowing them. But I ended up burning out in that church. And therapy, all the things that I was trying to find my way forward, were not being really helpful. And so my coworker, who had wanted to introduce me to the Enneagram before, came back around and said, "Look, I really think this would be really helpful for you." And so I engaged the Enneagram and really found my type in pathology, in the hardest parts. And for a 5, that would be paranoia, isolation, all the deeper parts of fear and being a fear-based number. And so that was really how I determined my type. And so the Enneagram as a gift to me was really a way of understanding a path forward in health, understanding the lies that I would tell myself, the way my personality structured work, and how it was holding me in place. And after I had used all the coping skills and really was struggling a lot.
Chris, thank you for sharing that. And you shared so much there. And 2 things that stood out to me is I find it interesting that the Enneagram seems to come along people's paths either at the burnout stage or just before it or just after it, or when like from a spiritual formation perspective, there's like the stages of faith. And when people are ready to go on that journey inward, the Enneagram's a good tool, for want of a better word to use, for that inward journey. Just out of interest, so to break a stereotype then of a self-preservation five, who might be seen as someone that is very careful with their energy and very careful with their time, yet here you were, before knowing that you were a self-preservation five, nearly at burnout. So, would you mind just sharing, like, how was that as a how did you allow yourself to get to that burnout stage? How did the self-preservation five, feed into that?
So the way I think about that, when I look back, is it was an interesting place because I was leading a congregation. I was in front of people. So as a self-preservation five, boundaries are really important. Separation is really important. And while those aspects were really an important part of my life, like I didn't like people to show up at my house. I didn't want to let people know where I was. There were very clear boundaries about what was available to people and what wasn't. Um, the sense of my fiveness was wanting to know. And I had been confident in my leadership in churches all of my career. And when I got to this particular church, everything that I had tried, everything that I knew wasn't working, in terms of growth, in terms of development, in terms of managing people, in terms of my style. And so it was the first time where I felt a level of incompetence. And looking back, almost every way that I was trying to find competence, to study, to learn, to do, was not getting me where I needed to go. And so the fear began to build, the isolation began to build. And even though I was in the midst of people all the time, it was when I felt the most isolated and the least trusting. And instead of looking for answers in what was going on around me, I continued to look inside, which pulled me deeper away. And so that sense of deep fear and withdrawing, which are really a part of being a five, really were contributing to me not seeking help, not trusting other people, not building teams, not learning from others well, not willing to fail. And instead of leaning into the moment, I was pulling away from
Okay, so Chris, was I hearing like a competent piece, like the stereotypically type five needs to be competent, and you're coming into this new role with experience, with competence, with knowledge, and what you've done in the past, it just doesn't seem to be working in this new job, and so that type five, I need to be competent, is being attacked or is being downplayed, and so like you said. To cope with that, you went into the self-pres 5 strategy of withdraw, protect, isolate.
it.
But I'm also hearing a need in you as well. Possibly to do with the forewing, perhaps. Possibly to do with where the sexual instinct is in your sequence. I know it's in second position, but I don't know how close it is to the dominant self-pres. But and maybe there's other reasons for it as well. But there's obviously a need in you to connect with people, which is
Right,
maybe another stereotype that people might think of fives as being not interested in connecting with people on a relation in a relational way.
right.
But obviously for you that that isn't true as a human being. Okay, as a type five, but as a human being, connection is really important to you.
It is. And
Yeah.
and what I've told in terms of my sequencing is probably my self-pres and sexual subtypes are very close together in that sequence. And that
Mm.
really is how I survived and thrived, even in leading and being in community and groups of people, even as a five so consistently, is that I would find people to connect with, find strategic people that I would draw from. And that sense of connection was a really important part of grounding in a network of relationships to know and to be able to lead moving forward. And
Mhm.
so I agree that you probably picked up on a big part of how my sequence plays out.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you, Chris. And for anyone that doesn't know this, the sexual five can look like a type four. So it's interesting how it's really close to your self-preservation instinct, as well as having the four wing as well. So it's like a double.
It is.
Yeah.
It is. It creates some interesting dynamics. So when people meet me as a five, they are not always sure that I'm self-pres dominant first, and sometimes
Mhm.
people aren't really sure I'm a five at first,
Okay.
just because of some of the and not trust me, I'm five through and through, but they just create some interesting wrinkles in how people experience me and my energy and what I do.
Okay. So just out of interest, over the years, what kind of feedback have you had from people thinking you can't be a five, thinking that you're another type?
Right. So normally what people experience in me is, wow, Chris, you really develop deep connection. Wow, Chris, you really have your emotions are available to you. Ah, you really have this very creative, romantic part of who you are. Wow, Chris, you really plug into people really well. Wow, you really so it's really that sense of connecting with people, of wanting to be around people, of seeing people deeply, of not being afraid of leaning into that. And as people experience that, at least initially, as they get to know me, it brings up some questions for them.
So what numbers have people thought that you might have been other than a five?
Well, I think in terms of emotion, people will often go, Chris, are you a four? Like, are you a four or
Okay,
five? Like, tell me where you are. In the more highly anxious stages of when I was presenting to people, people thought I might have been a six and how I had done that.
interesting.
And as I've gotten healthier, people who are new to the Enneagram and experience me in very confident places, are you sure you're not an eight? Are you sure you're not bringing more energy to the moment? And so, that not as much, but more of the four and sometimes the six, that will be where people.
Okay, but I wonder if the eight feedback is actually a compliment to the growth work that you've done.
Yes, that's my point. Is that
Yeah.
as I've done growth work and that confidence has been more available,
Mm.
um, the part for me, um, when I first started sequencing people, some of the questioning was, are you social dominant? You lead a church, you run a staff, you're involved with people. How does that work? And other than saying that that was a real bad joke on God's part, right? To take a
Mm.
self-pres five and call me to be in front and lead people. Um, part of that was I had developed this kind of ability to hide in plain sight as a self-pres five, to show up in groups and not quite like a three in terms of being a chameleon, but like a five and blend into moments. That's
Mm.
also been a place in which people have asked questions. Are you sure you're not social dominant? How does that play out? And so that's probably the other place that people ask some questions as they get to know me.
Okay. So before learning about the Enneagram, when you were in front of people, like leading, did you ever feel uncomfortable about it? Was it really draining of your energy? Did you when you got back home, you're like, oh, I'm exhausted now.
Yes, yes, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that was probably the piece. Now, having done some growth work, as I lean into that social dominant subtype, a social repressed subtype, and lean that, having the support of done work with my dominant subtype and my sexual subtype, it's a lot easier and less draining to really be in front of people, be with people, relax, and let energy flow. Before I was amping up, creating energy, showing up and kind of forcing that space in a way. And so, yes, it was very draining and spent a lot of time sleeping and isolating when I would come home, pulling away from people to make up for the energy that I was contriving and developing to be able to be in front of people and be with people so consistently.
Mm. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. That's really inspiring. So now that you're using the repressed social instinct, that's probably less repressed now because you've been working on it and
Right.
bringing it online more.
Yes.
Are you finding that you've got more energy? You use the word flow. Are you finding that you're not having to like isolate yourself so much
Right.
after being with people?
Yeah. The way I look at it, Matt, and I'm as a five, I would never want to speak for other people, right? So as
Sure.
I talk for myself, all of that energy really wasn't about being in front of people. and dealing with people and engaging people. In my experience, um, the energy was both trying to be in front of people and maintain all of my coping and defense mechanisms. So trying to stay disconnected, trying to compartmentalize, trying not to allow emotion to rise, trying to be rational. All of this while being with and around people. So as probably the turning point. Let me go back to when I burned out. The turning point for me in my deconstruction on some level was when I had to stand up in front of the church, in front of 500 people, and tell them that I had been leading out of fear, that I didn't know what I was doing, that I had been struggling. And that was a turning point for me because that was the first time in public, in front of people, I had laid bare all the ways that I had failed or had given in to the fear that was driving me at the time. And I didn't have Enneagram language to do that. So once that happened and I really began to feel into that, it began a journey of not defending myself against people and not trying to withdraw as much. I still do it because it's still a part of my structure. But now when I'm with people, I don't hold back. I laugh. I enjoy. If I need to step away, I step away. But there's a lot more available for me with people because I'm not trying to protect myself from people. I'm not trying to withdraw and play this whole game. And that gives me more energy. And energy is always available. The lie for a 5 is that we don't have energy. The truth is, all the energy we have is needed and is available to us at any time. And it's actually available to us in the relationship, in the conversation, in the engagement. But in our 5 structure, we actually want to believe the opposite. We'd much rather take our toys and go home than to believe there's actually energy in the engagement itself.
Okay, thank you, Chris. So if you could go back in time and speak to a younger version of yourself, or if a self-preservation 5 is listening to this and is thinking, I'm really resonating with what Chris is sharing now. What kind of advice could you give your earlier self, a self-preservation 5, to help them, with that self-preservation 5 piece in social situations?
The greatest turning point is when someone said to me, Chris, exactly what you're looking for inside of you may not find until you engage the other person. And once they said that, that really unlocked the key of what I was experiencing. As a self-preservation 5, everything that I'm trying to find inside myself and only inside myself actually may not be available until I let my guard down and engage and really have an open and authentic relationship with someone else. And um, and as I've learned that and practiced that over and over and over again, everything that I've needed has always found its way there. And that's
Mm.
probably the closest thing I would say at the very beginning of a journey for a self-pres 5. Because self-pres 5s, we're pretty stubborn in our belief that there really is we really can't trust relationships and trust that energy will be there. We're pretty stubborn about
Okay. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. And also, I'm just really struck by how vulnerable you were back along in standing up in front of 500 people and saying, without having the language, the Enneagram language to help support you with that, and just that was so vulnerable as a social
that.
repressed self-preservation 5 to do that.
Yes.
Like, wow, that's really inspiring.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
You know, having some language now, not necessarily Enneagram language, but other language, um, looking back in that moment, what it really was a moment of alignment and integrity. I wanted to be a good leader. I wanted to lead faithfully. I wanted to show up in a way that was going to move people forward out from the place of leadership that I was given. And being able to put aside all the reasons why I would not want to do that and step into that moment and be in alignment with more of my authentic self and more of what I really know in my heart I wanted, it really was a step that built a foundation to really begin to do more of that. So I really appreciate you naming that because that really was a turning point and it really was really vulnerable. And just just going back to that memory, and I can still feel it in my body what it was like to sit and stand in that place. Yeah, it was important. It really was.
Yeah. Yeah, and very well, I'm very inspired by that. Very inspired. So thank you for sharing that, Chris.
Yeah.
In what ways would you say the Enneagram has been most specifically helpful to you?
Yeah. So what in my recovery, in my healing, what it told me was all the lies, right? So when I didn't know what to do, I did everything my mind was telling me not to do. So that was really helpful at that time. So every time my personality would tell me, "Don't trust someone," oh, I need to trust someone. Every time my personality was telling me, "Chris, don't go outside your office, just stay inside," I was like, "Okay, I need to walk outside and engage people." Every time that my brain was telling me or my personality was telling me I needed to do something, the Enneagram gave me an ability to name it for what it was as a defense, and then be able to make a conscious decision that was counter to that. That ultimately, although it was painful, although it was very disorienting, it ultimately led me to greater places of health along that side of the journey. So the Enneagram gave that to me, and that was really helpful. And then once I was able to find some firmer footing and build some stronger internal structure, um, then I was able to use some of the language of the Enneagram to talk about expanding, growing, engaging, sharing, being more available to the moment. I was telling somebody earlier before I came on that I was going to do this podcast, and they were like, "Really? You're going to do a podcast?" And I was like, "Yes." And they're like, "Wow, that seems so different for a five because a lot of podcasters are struggling to find fives sometimes." And I said, "Oh, this is my work. Look, anytime my work is to say yes, I'm going to put myself out into the world and be vulnerable and show up." And so I wouldn't have had the opportunity to do that or the language for it if the Enneagram had come up.
Mhm. Thank you for sharing that, Chris. And I really appreciate you showing up in this space.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank you. So I know that you're also a Christian.
Yes.
In what ways have you found the experience of the Enneagram as a Christian? What's that kind of journey been like for you?
Yeah. It's been an interesting journey. I think on a couple of levels. I think one, um, it's really allowed me to be clearer in some ways about what I had thought was intuition or where I had interpreted this kind of experience of God and where was my personality. So when was I discerning this kind of divine intervention or divine information or wisdom that's being shared, and then learning about the Enneagram and oh, this is when Paul talks about the flesh and the spirit. This is a way that I can understand that. What is more me and what is actually God? And that's been helpful in discerning, what is that voice? And is that really from God or is that really more of my personality? Even my ego masquerading as God. And and that also has been in the interpretation of scripture. So whenever I look at the Bible and I'm reading the Bible, it also gives me a chance to pay attention to, oh, what are the things that my personality is naturally attracted to? Oh, look at this wisdom literature. Oh, look how wise these sayings are. Oh, look at how interesting this is. And then what passages or what parts of scripture do I have blind spots for because of the way my personality wants to see God, filters God. And then, of course, what does it mean to be in community? Because that's a big part of being a Christian, not just relationship with God or relationship with our holy text, but also what does it mean to be in relationship with people and to be able to honor and see the body of Christ, the giftedness of people, and that's been a big part of how that's impacted my faith.
Mm, brilliant. Again, thank you for sharing that, Chris. And as a church leader, someone with a because I was listening to a book yesterday, taking the Enneagram Goes to Church, and in it says, if a church leader has a certain personality type, which we all do, and they're
Yeah.
not aware of it, there can be some blind spots to go with it, and so. We're
Yes.
going to just focus on a specific part of the Bible, or we're going to major in this and we're going to minor in this,
Right.
depending on what the subtype is. So have you shown your awareness, like how's your awareness of your type and other people's types being in the community? Has it
Right.
changed the way that you show up as a leader as well?
Oh, yes. So as you were just sharing, what came from me is Before, there were natural people that I was inclined to build relationships with, people that would feel complimentary, right? And for fives, not all fives, but for some fives, we have an experience. One of the reasons we build walls, not boundaries, but walls, is that we've had intrusive energy in our life. Or we've had neglectful energy in our life. And so when we get into church leadership, sometimes those can be reactive energies, whether they're in a group or in a people or a particular person, or whether they're in I'm a part of an institutional church, a larger organization called the United Methodist Church. And so whether that's in Episcopal leaders or people that we engage with, often the dynamics we have can be very reactive and not responsive if we're not in touch with our type, and the types of energy that we feel complement us and we feel energy in, and the types of energy that we may feel resistant to. So that can happen in people in the church, it can happen in leadership, and it can happen in how we select leaders in the church and people we feel comfortable with. So there can definitely be blind spots there if we're not mindful of
Mm, that is so interesting. And like on a more sort of lower level, stereotypical way, depending on what our subtype is, there will be subtypes that will be more triggering for other subtypes,
it. Right.
because of the way that the defense mechanisms are set up.
Yeah.
But I guess when we become aware of ourselves and other people, I think for me, what the Enneagrams helps me do is go from feeling like I'm underneath
Uh-huh.
to the same level. So
Right.
where I would have put some personality types up here and I'm here, it's helped
Uh-huh.
me go zoop, and
Yeah.
it's it helps me show up with more confidence in professionally and personally. Yeah.
There's some um, work that I do in other areas, and it talks about being one up or one down on people. And
Okay.
so what comes up for me in your image is, we're all human. That's really,
Yeah.
we're all human being, we're all humans in a human institution that claims and has the audacity to believe it reflects some deeper nature of God, right? And so, as a self-pres five, my goal is not to deal with my insecurity and fear by being confident and wanting to be one above. Like, I want to know more. I want to know enough. I want to feel confident. So who are people that I can feel better than, greater than, smarter than, more, that can be a part of my personality type. And I can be one below people. Oh, I'm not as good as they are, or I'm not as strong as they are, or this is how I'm interpreting your image. It's not what exactly you were saying. But I think in the Enneagram world, what it says is we're all human. So how do we just own who we are, own what we bring to the table, own our blind spots, and then how do we work together? And for me, it took a lot of energy out of trying to be either one up over people, stronger, smarter, or even when my personality and my insecurities were flaring and I felt less than people, or not as strong as people, or not as good as people. And the
Mm,
Enneagram really gave me language to really make and see that we're all on the same level.
yeah. Thank you, Chris. No, I think what you shared perfectly illustrates what I was saying. Yeah, that's a perfect illustration of it. Yeah, exactly that piece. And there's obviously going to be different reasons why different subtypes are going to be positioning themselves. And that's what I find interesting. What you shared actually is maybe it's not just up or down. Maybe it can be both, but for different reasons.
Mhm.
Very interesting. Yeah,
Well, in my
yeah.
experience of self-pres, so the tension I have within myself, if I own within my heart, is that tension between, as a self-pres, both wanting to be taken care of in some ways and having the world show up and be a nice, warm place that's going to be safe for me, and that sexual subtype energy of me that says, I don't want you to take care of me. I'm going to take care of myself, and I'm going to show up, and I'm going to do whatever I have to do to be able to make some of that happen. And so within me, and that's how I characterize those subtype energies.
Mm.
So when I experience, even as a leading with self-pres, when I experience sexual dominant subtypes, which is before they'd be very scary for me and very intrusive and very energetic. Now what's really awesome is that when I engage someone who I assume is a sexual dominant subtype, it's actually very energizing for me. I'm like, I can actually feel their energy. And because I feel stronger and more solid inside, I can allow that energy to pick me up, and I can then meet them with that energy. And before I had that awareness and would have done some growth work, that would have been a very anxiety producing or reactive moment for me. And it's not that it isn't sometimes when I'm not conscious in the moment, but when I'm able to be conscious and show up, it's actually really a great invitation to some more energetic engagement.
Mm. I love that, Chris, and I think that's another reason why I love the Enneagram. It just helps. It just helps with relationships, whether it's professional or personal. And that's a perfect example of that. Whereas before there may have been a relational disconnect because of an energy piece, but now you're able to meet the energy. And yeah, within Christian circles, within Christianity, have you had any sort of major pushback from anybody with the Enneagram as a Christian?
I think there are churches. I think sometimes my experience of the pushback I receive is that one, people don't really understand what the Enneagram is, and because it becomes very faddish and becomes this kind of game that people play, I think a lot of people feel hesitant about it and really push back, and they don't see it as a compliment to their faith, and how that can contribute. And so I think a lot of times there's pushback because people really don't understand the Enneagram, understand its purpose. And I think sometimes, I'm going to make a very broad generalization, sometimes we as church people get really enamored by the new thing. And when we lean into it, we really don't understand how other people experience that. Right. And so
Mm.
I think some of that happens. The only other pushback I've received, and this has only happened a couple of times, and that's when I talked about instinctual sequences and subtypes. And some of that comes from the ways in which we talk about some of those very animal features of who we are, and subtypes and instinctual sequences. They're a lot more complicated than we often teach in the Enneagram world, because there's a lot that goes in when we talk about the sexual instinct and the subtype that forms. That's not just one drive. That's probably really layers of evolution and instinctual things that we kind of bring together around this idea or this concept. But I think for people who struggle with the idea of evolution, and I live in a more conservative place in the world where there are still people who have very differing views about what scientific development is, evolution, and things are. I've had some pushback when I've tried to talk about those things in the framework that some of the dominant Enneagram schools teach about. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Chris. I see that because it could lean in or does lean into a different worldview. Um, yeah, so I appreciate you sharing that. I think over the years, as I've grown and I'm growing, um, I think I think I've released God outside of my small box,
Right.
and there's a lot more that I don't know than what I do know.
Yes, and I think the gift of the Enneagram is that it is almost infinite in its ability to be understood and used and utilized, and so I think it really creates an opportunity for openness when it's really engaged at the level that it's really created for.
Yeah. Thank you, Chris. Is there anything else you'd like to share about being a Christian with the Enneagram that I might not have asked that you want to share?
No, it's just that's a great question. I think on leadership, I'll say this, and you've alluded to it, but um, one of the things that I would probably do, one of the things that well, actually, two things that I would do differently. Um, I think actually going back into churches and probably teaching instinctual sequence and subtypes first,
Okay.
because I think type plays a difference, but I do lean toward the school that whenever there's conflict or resonance, it has a lot more to do with subtype than it actually does with type. So when I walk into a committee or a team or a group of people, um, sensing and kind of intuiting maybe what the dominant subtype of the group is or who are the dominant people and what their subtypes are actually have a great influence over the character or the feeling of the room and what their energy is, what their focus is on, and how they engage one another. I think probably going back, I would maybe teach that or begin the foundation of that first, because I actually think that probably has a greater influence over church structures as I've seen them. I think that also has to do in in relationships. So I do a lot of marital counseling, premarital counseling, all those types of things. So I think subtype would be something I'd emphasize more. The other part too is I think the ideas of the virtues and the holy ideas. I think when we talk about spiritual gifts, when we talk about what gift each number can bring to the world, I think we start talking about passions. Which is that core lower heart piece that really forms the basis for our personality. I think in church world, it really helps to get past that to to the passion. I mean, to the holy ideas and to the virtues, so that people can see that when grace is available, when presence is there, what is unlocked in these numbers and in our personalities that others can't bring or don't bring as clearly as we do in this particular type. And I think
Mm.
for churches that teach the Enneagram, I think teaching the very basic personality piece is good, but I think moving to that next level actually may be really helpful for people to understand. Those are the two things.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Chris. And with the instinctual subtype piece, whilst some Christians, maybe not just Christians, maybe other people as well, could get hung up on the label, um, if there's another way of describing the reality of it.
Right.
And as you and I would have been taught through CP Enneagram Academy, the instinctual drives, the sexual drive, the self-preservation drive, the social drive, they're non-negotiable.
Right.
These are non-negotiable drives. And so, like you
Right.
say, if you've got a leader with a certain subtype, whether they're aware of it or not, these are non-negotiable instincts at play.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, until we become aware of what they are, and yeah, it's very interesting. And also with the piece around what was it that you shared after that? The other piece.
Oh, the holy
Um,
idea of virtues,
yeah, the
moving.
holy ideas. Yes, yeah. So rather than majoring on, let's um, let's major on the strengths of the ego, rather than majoring on the strengths of um, the holy ideas and the person behind the presentation of the ego, if that makes sense.
Yes. Yes.
What I would call the true strengths rather than the egoic strengths.
Yes.
That makes sense. Yeah. I love that. Yeah. So it's a transformational tool, isn't it? In that
It
way, in that
is.
sense.
And that's what I think. The difference when I teach the Enneagram in my community here in North Texas. There's a lot of people that understand the Enneagram just as a descriptive tool. It
Mm.
describes because that's what they've been taught. That's as far as they've gone. But really understanding it as transformational and growth oriented, I think is very helpful because at least at this moment in the world right now, people want to grow. They want to have an idea of what that would be and how that would show up. And so I
Yeah.
think that's really important too. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I agree, Chris. Thank you for sharing that. So, when it came to discovering your self-preservation 5, what was that journey like of discovering that?
It was twofold. I think I both realized that I was self-preservation dominant and also social repressed. I think that happened about
Okay.
the same time because in my growth journey, I realized I isolate. I don't want people to know where I am. I don't like to take pictures. The way my self-preservation shows up is I'm very conscious of my physical safety. I'm very conscious of temperature. I'm very conscious of these things. And as I became more aware of that, all of the egoic reasons I had for showing up in front of people, I began to really see, oh, yeah, I really don't like being in front of groups of people. Oh, I really don't want to engage. And I really don't think about teams. I don't think about groups naturally. It's actually, I have to prompt myself to think about what's going on without thinking about taking care of myself and my physical safety and my financial safety and how much food I'm eating and am I eating enough and am I going to miss a meal and am I blah, 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 blah. All that energy that just goes into what I interpret as self-preservation dominant, preoccupations and drive.
Okay. Thanks, Chris. So, were you reading various Enneagram books, taking various Enneagram tests, um, before deciding? Was it a case of explore? Did you think you were other numbers before you were a type 5, or did you, when you got to 5, you're like, that is me?
Yeah, I just kind of knew,
Okay.
distant, playing poker, not giving away a lot of information, all those things. It just kind of knew from the feedback I had gotten all my life. And just like I said, from the pathology of what I was struggling with at the time, all the things that I was doing to try to save my life, that was those were all dominant five characteristics.
Okay. Did you take a test at all, or was it just a case of reading a book and just going, yeah, that's me?
Yeah. Once I started reading some material, that was it. I didn't take tests at the time. I didn't take my first test until I went to my first CP Enneagram training, and then I took
Okay.
one there. But I hadn't taken a test before because once I read it, I just knew it, and I knew that I had other qualities that were available that were present in other personality types. But I just knew that I was a five. And at that time, the teacher that I was really listening to and working with said, listen, before you try to learn any other numbers, just take a year and just read everything about your number. Like just focus on your number, what you are, how you are. And so that first year, once I really determined, oh yeah, I'm a five, I really didn't look at other numbers. I just learned and read as much as I could about what being a five was and what that was about.
Mm.
And that leans into fiveness anyway. Why not go deep, right? So
Yeah.
that's a big part of being a five too. So that's what I did at first, and that really helped me
Thank you, Chris. Yeah, I find it interesting that we approach finding our type as our type.
well, and that was the big thing. They would say, until you find yourself in your type, you really can't do anything about anything else. And then once
Yeah.
I was like, I learned like my type. I live, everything. And so when I tell people that, when I teach it and when I coach people and do that kind of work, I say, look, we do everything in our type. Like you don't even realize it, but when you sit down at the dinner table, you do that in your type. Like you just do everything in your type until you kind of can name it and see it.
Yeah. It's so helpful to be able to see the patterns, as you were describing earlier, as something that might be going on or are going on inside of us. But when we can almost disidentify from the patterns or recognize them or see them in the moment,
Right.
oh, I'm doing this self-preservation 6 thing again. Ah, here's the
Uh,
self-preservation 5 script again and again.
yeah.
And being able to be conscious and to literally go, as you've said before, in a different direction to get different results. Yeah.
And there was at first, talking about the one down and the one up. At first, I was like, God, here I go again. This is driving me nuts. And I used to beat myself. At first, I was like beating myself up for being a five. Like, God, can I not
Okay.
stop? But now I laugh at it. I'm like, oh, there I go again. Oh, there, my personality just hijacked my body. Oh, I can't. Yep, there I go. And that really, in talking about opening personality up and doing the work, that was one of the biggest turns for me. Is when I could just laugh at myself and really just enjoy just how much of a part of this. Because what I teach and whenever I do, these are systems that saved our lives. They are systems that are very sophisticated ways for us to be able to handle the emotional, mental, and physical realities of whatever childhood we grew up in and whatever world we grew up in. And so understanding them and their liabilities is important. And then once we can own that, then we can see their value and then begin to embrace them as a part of who we are, just not all of who we are. And
Mm.
that's been really helpful for me and the people that I've.
Thank you, Chris. I just want to highlight something else that you've mentioned about the when we grow in self-awareness. Maybe this is going to be more true for certain types than others, but I think it's true for all of us. Is that self-criticism, that self-judgment, that berating of ourselves, that so befriending and having compassion for the patterns that were there, to help us essentially. Yeah.
Yeah. That's true in type, and that's been really helpful. And while in the instinctual and the subtype world, we talk about being really clear because those are drives. So you kind of have to be a little more aggressive in stopping the patterns, saying no, and really engaging them. I find it's a balance of both being very assertive and clear when those instinctual drives are just taking things over, and being compassionate and understanding. Like for instance, for me, whenever I think about my self-pres dominance. that comes through generations of my family. Like I can see back into how that self-preservation dominant came through my family, through my grandparents, into my parents, and how it influenced all the way into me. And when we talk about being generational cycle breakers and things like that, it's really being able to see the patterns, embrace them, appreciate them, and expand beyond them, and be able to see what more is available and what other decisions we can make. And I think those things are really important. So yeah, it's good.
Yeah. Something very powerful that you touched on there, for want of a better way of describing it, is a life script. Like we're
Right.
not born as a blank piece of paper. We come in, don't we, with this generation with generational stuff,
Yeah.
and we're not, and it's almost a script before we've even chosen to do one thing. We've got this script that we're on, and then life experiences happen that confirm the script. So the fact that you're able to recognize it and break it and go in a different direction, I truly believe that we are doing the generations that are going to follow us um, a good service by breaking the scripts that have gone before us.
Yeah. And I think back to, theological ideas of free will, I think
Mm.
it puts free will into context. How many choices are we really making? How much is really scripted? And then my hope, I think, like you, is that we are beginning to see exactly what is available to us as humans in terms of making choice, in terms of growth, in terms of being able to see different options and make different choices in our lives. And I think it's a pivotal place in our human development.
Yeah, me too, Chris. And Jesus, one of Jesus's opening statements when he began his ministry was, "I've come to set the captives free." And I
Yeah.
personally see being held captive by a script that we didn't choose or a pattern of personality. Okay, yeah, it's there to help us, but it's still a form of imprisonment, you know,
Yeah.
that robs
Yeah.
us of our true free choice.
I agree. And because I teach, and this is some of the things that we learn is that, our personality is a defensive structure. And so I think understanding those scripts is really important, especially in the world that we live today, in which there's so much fear and uncertainty and volatility. And so all of us live a little more contracted in our lives and in our personalities. And so being able to expand and see and follow a different path other than the ones that dominant culture gives us, I think is really, really important. Um, Maybe even for the survival of our species at this time.
Wow. I won't name any names, but when an unhealthy, powerful ego pattern goes to war against another unhealthy ego pattern. And I can't help but think when Jesus says that the reason why we need to love our enemies is because, well, they're not really our enemies. It's almost like a sleepwalking zombie at war with another sleepwalking zombie.
Exactly. And I talk about that in terms of our shadows, right? Like
Mm,
what we're doing is we're all sleepwalking, so we don't even see other people. We just see projections of our own issues, right? And so you get two powerful zombies who really are trying to play war, and they're really shadow boxing against one another and
mm,
trying to fight for something. And see it all in terms of superpowers and countries that are playing out their type on some larger scale, just not even seeing each other because they're lost and sleepwalking in their own stuff. Yeah, it's a great image. It's a great
yeah.
image.
Um, Chris, thank you for sharing all that you've shared. Is there anything else you'd like to share about being a self-preservation five that you found really helpful as a Christian, or just in your experience of it?
As a self preservation five, my experience, I think the biggest part of engaging that self compassion piece really came in terms of loneliness. As a five, loneliness, sadness, isolation, all of that wraps together. And, fives, we kind of live off rations of life. We deprive ourselves and live very reductionistic lifestyles in certain ways as a way to combat needing other people, opening ourselves up to some of the pain we experienced or interpreted in our environment growing up. And so I think as a self-pres 5, I think really leaning in and finding healthy ways to have compassion, connection, and really looking into some of those disowned parts of who we are that were lonely and sad and felt neglected or felt intruded upon and not appreciated. Those aren't um, things that are just unique to fives, but the ways in which we experience those things are really powerful, especially self-pres fives. And so I think really being able to support ourselves, figure out ways to do that really gives us the foundation internally to lean in and prop ourselves up and put ourselves in a position for growth. So that's probably the only thing I would say, just as a real broad stroke in passing, if that
Mm.
resonates with another five to do that. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Chris. And what kind of specific ways have you been supported on that journey?
Right. So what I realized, there's several things that I really did. I think one, I used the reparenting inner child framework as a way to really engage that part of who I am and really find ways that make sense to me. Um, and then also I made an incredible effort to build Team Chris, really to build like a coach, therapist, my doctors. I intentionally seek out friends and build relationships with friends, so I have a network of support, asking for support, practicing that. So really building and doing that with intentionality, even when it's discomfort, even when it's uncomfortable or seems irrelevant or unnecessary. All those things are really, really important. And so those were just a few of the things I did. Um,
Mm.
and to show up on things like this and to be like, oh, I'm going to do really, really outgoing things and I'm going to get to know new people and I'm going to see people face to face that I engage with online. And now this is a relationship that has energy and resources for it. And that
Mm.
would not be something that I would have really leaned into.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Chris. And again, the work that inner work that you've done and that you're doing is an inspiration to me and an inspiration to anyone else that's on the path. That's so well used saying, isn't it, in Enneagram circles, being on the path.
Right.
But it's for want of a better way of wording it, it's just being on the path of growth, isn't it? And seeing the patterns and being conscious, going in different directions, and growing as a result.
Yes, it has
Yeah.
been. That is.
It's very inspiring. So, Chris, I know that you also work with the Enneagram professionally. Can you share what it is that you do, where people can find out more about your work and what you have to offer?
Sure. So whenever I was in the church world, I started with the Enneagram. That was a part of my healing journey. And I started teaching it in the church. And then I realized that there were a lot of people that were no longer going to church that still had a sense of spirituality and faith, that were trying to figure out how to cultivate purpose in their lives. And the Enneagram, because it is something that people are familiar with and that people are interested in, it became a doorway to begin to have conversations. And so I began to develop these relationships with professionals. I'd meet with them and really kind of become a corporate chaplain in some ways to their teams and to them as individual leaders, using the Enneagram, but also bringing this spiritual guide part of who I am to the work that I was doing. And so that really began to expand. And so I love doing that. But then also realizing that there is this emotional intelligence piece that's going on in the world about developing deeper awareness that's a big part of where we are. And because I want the best for our species, I want the best for humanity, I want the best for that. And because I think we are at a really critical moment over the next few decades of what's going to be the future, that emotional intelligence, self awareness, self leadership piece is what I find really a ministry in some ways into the corporate world. So I've worked with Google. I have doing some work with Meta. I have some relationships in other organizations, venture capital places, doing things. And I find it expanding really as a one-on-one piece out of people who want to grow, who feel stuck. And the Enneagram and coaching is really a great place for
Wow. Thanks for sharing that, Chris. Again, that's really inspiring, the work that you're doing.
them. Right.
Where can people find out? Do you have a website and an email
Yep.
address?
Yep. So you can email me at chris@clsleadership.com, or you can find my website, clsleadership.com. That's where you can find out a little bit more about me and you can contact me through the website.
Brilliant. Thank you, Chris. Well, I'm going to put links to those in the descriptions below so people can just click and go straight to you.
Awesome. I appreciate that.
Yeah. Chris, is there anything else you'd like to share that I haven't asked, or anything else that you just like to share from your experience of the Enneagram over the years?
You've asked great questions. I feel like I've said everything that comes to mind, and I just really appreciate the opportunity to get to know you, for you to get to know me, and for me to be a part of your audience and get to know them.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for all that you've shared. It's been very insightful, and I look forward to connecting with you again.
All right. Thanks, Matt. I appreciate it.